Chapter 2136. In the morning court, Hellion Theo was sitting on the high seat. Although he didn't seem to have changed, the people who followed Hellion Theo all year round could clearly feel that the emperor seemed to be in a good mood today. After the court ended, Hellion Theo headed to the palace without thinking. "Your Majesty, the memorial?" Muda looked at Hellion Theo's actions and suddenly widened his eyes in surprise. He looked at Hellion Theo and asked, "Send someone to bring it to my palace." Hellion Theo paused when he heard this. After a moment of silence, he threw out this sentence and then turned around and continued to walk towards the palace. Muda was stunned. He didn't know why Hellion Theo was doing this, but since the emperor ordered him to do so, he naturally did as he was told. After the memorial was sent in, the emperor dismissed everyone. Muda was confused. He seemed to have thought of something, but also seemed to have forgotten something. Hellion Theo suddenly became very mysterious. He ignored the concubines even more. But at this time, a piece of news came. "What did you say?" Hellion Theo sat on the high seat and looked at Muda, who came to report the news. His eyes were full of astonishment. "The imperial concubine is pregnant with the imperial son." Muda's words were full of joy. He repeated it again. Hellion Theo's face was full of surprise. He didn't expect that incident would make Xiaqing pregnant. Hellion Theo didn't know how to feel. At this moment, Hellion Theo's feelings were incomparably complicated. Let the imperial physician nurse the imperial concubine's body well. Be sure to protect my imperial son. Hellion Theo was silent for a moment. After saying this sentence to Muda, he stood up and seemed to be about to leave. "Your Majesty, aren't you going to see the imperial concubine?" Looking at Hellion Theo's unchanged face, Mulder was slightly stunned. Then, he blinked his eyes and looked at Hellion Theo in confusion. "We won't be going over." Hellion Theo was stunned when he heard this, but he said quietly, "From today onwards, the imperial consort's health is the most important. No matter what, the imperial consort must give birth to this child. If anyone dares to harm the imperial consort, kill them on the spot." "Yes." Muda's body trembled when he heard this. He instantly understood what Hellion Theo meant. What Hellion Theo valued was the child in Xiaqing's belly, not Xiaqing herself. Muda went to the imperial concubine's residence and brought all the good rewards. It seemed like a favor, but the emperor never showed up. This made the imperial concubines very curious. They didn't know what the emperor meant by doing this. But from the looks of it, he didn't seem to care much about the imperial concubine. Hellion Theo returned to his bedroom. As soon as he stepped into the bedroom, he was hugged tightly. Hellion Theo was so shocked that he almost reached out to hit the person. Before he could say anything, his head was grabbed and fiercely kissed. They kissed until Hellion Theo was dizzy and didn't let go. "Your concubine is pregnant?" Feng Maching's hoarse voice sounded. A pair of pitch-black eyes stared intently at Hellion Theo as he asked. "Yes." Hellion Theo's lips were very red. He didn't dare to raise his head to look at Feng Maching. For some reason, he felt like he was caught in the act. "That was an accident." Hellion Theo waited for a long time, but Feng Maching didn't answer. He quickly raised his head and said. Seeing Feng Maching's silent appearance, he felt a little uneasy. Chapter 2137. Yes, it was an accident. Feng Maching's eyes were deep as he slowly released Hellion Theo. When Hellion Theo saw Feng Maching's expression, he suddenly felt uncomfortable and sat silently at the side. Feng Maching didn't hug Hellion Theo like he usually did. He stayed for a while before leaving. Hellion Theo leaned back in his chair in annoyance. This was the first time he was so upset. This child came too suddenly and caught Hellion Theo off guard. However, after thinking about it carefully, this child didn't seem to be a bad thing. Hellion had an heir. The Northern Pastoral had an heir after all. Hellion Theo knew very well that he couldn't bear a child with another woman. Therefore, this child was very important. However, Hellion Theo was a little worried. When this child grew up, if he found out about his father. When he thought of this, Hellion Theo felt a sharp pain in his heart. He silently closed his eyes. Some things had to be faced. Perhaps it would be a good thing. Hellion Theo's mind was filled with wild thoughts. At this moment, Hellion Theo suddenly thought of Jingyu. If it was Jingyu would definitely choose to face this situation without hesitation. Such a special woman was always so dazzling. Hellion Theo smiled faintly. Every day, he would listen to the Imperial Concubine's reports from the Imperial Concubine. In his heart, he was thinking about how he hadn't seen Feng Maching for 3 to 4 days. For the first time, Hellion Theo felt a little annoyed. What has my friend been doing these days? Hellion Theo couldn't help but ask after holding it in for a long time. Is your Majesty talking about Tower Lord Feng? When Muda heard Hellion Theo's question, he was momentarily stunned. After a moment of silence, he said, Tower Lord Feng seems to have left the palace. Left the palace? Why didn't I know anything about it? Hellion Theo widened his eyes in shock when he heard that Feng Maching had left the palace. Didn't His Majesty give Manor Lord Feng the right to freely enter and exit the palace? That's why Manor Lord Feng didn't report her entry and exit. Hellion Theo had told everyone that Feng Maching was his savior. Everyone in the palace was extremely respectful to Feng Maching. Hearing the Emperor's tone now, could it be that he was blaming him for not reporting it? Muda silently wiped off his sweat and stood still, not daring to move. We understand. You may leave. Just as Mulder was about to be reprimanded by Hellion Theo said this and continued reading the memorials as if nothing had happened. Muda was confused, but he didn't dare to ask any questions. He silently retreated. Another 2 days passed, and Feng Maching was still nowhere to be seen. Hellion Xiu suddenly recalled what Feng Maching had said when he came over. He said that he was leaving. A few days ago, Feng Maching was clearly unhappy about the palace concubine's pregnancy. Could it be that Feng Maching had silently left without saying goodbye? When Hellion Theo thought of this possibility, his expression immediately changed. He abruptly stood up and anxiously walked towards Feng Maching's palace. When he reached the palace's entrance, Hellion Theo stopped in his tracks. All this time, Feng Maching had been the one to look for him and follow him. This was the first time he had come to Feng Maching's residence. You all wait outside. Hellion Xiu coldly threw down a sentence before stepping into the room. Chapter 2138. Muda didn't notice Hellion Theo's reddened face and didn't know what had happened. After that, Hellion Theo was injured from time to time. Muda was very worried, but he complained that brothel master Feng shouldn't have used her power just because she was the Emperor's savior. However, Muda saw that Hellion Theo didn't say anything, so he naturally couldn't say anything as a servant. The cold winter arrived in the blink of an eye. Hellion Xiu wrapped himself in a thick coat and walked into Feng Maching's courtyard. Inside the house, Feng Maching was handing the letter in his hand to the guard beside him. When he saw Hellion Xiu enter, he raised his hand and waved his hand to dismiss him. Why did you call me over in such a hurry? Hellion Theo looked suspiciously at the guard who left with the envelope. He frowned and turned to Feng Maching. Did something happen at Sanluo Tower? Nothing. Feng Maching reached out and hugged Hellion Theo in his arms. He said casually, there have been a lot of assassination missions recently, but it has nothing to do with us. Oh. Hellion Theo wanted to ask something, but Feng Maching covered his mouth. Your Majesty should come warm the bed, Feng Maching said vaguely. Hellion Theo raised his hand and struggled. Feng Maching was always like this. Every time he saw Feng Maching's infatuated expression, Hellion Theo felt his heart tremble. The temperature in the room rose little by little. The rolling body under the red candlelight was silent and oppressive. From within the courtyard, a black shadow silently flashed out. When he appeared in the empty space outside the palace, he took out the letter from his bosom and walked towards a house to have someone deliver the letter. In the Roman forest, the winter seemed to be even colder. White snow covered the entire Roman forest. When the sun came out during the day, a gray wolf could be seen striding out. On top of this gray wolf sat a small figure. Wow, so beautiful. The person sitting on the back of the gray wolf was naturally Xiaozin. He had not seen him for a year, but he seemed to have grown a lot. Yes. A very calm voice came from behind him. Naturally, it was Xiaozin. Father, mother, look at these icicles. Xiaozin got down from Yinjin's body and raised his head in surprise. After Xiaozin finished his words, he saw a window open on the tree trunk. Jingyu, who was wrapped in a robe, poked her head out and looked at the snow-white scenery outside. She narrowed her eyes and said, "You too, be careful." "I know, mother." Xiaozin smiled and responded. Then, he went to play in the snow and ice with his short legs. "It's so cold." Jingyu sighed. Xiaochen appeared behind Jingyu at some point in time. He reached out to hug Jingyu and said, "Northern Pastoral Feng Maching sent a letter." A letter? When Jingyu heard this, she was very happy and opened her eyes wide. She turned to Xiaochen and asked, "Where's the letter? Give it to me." Xiaochen looked at Jingyu's excited appearance and suddenly frowned. "Ha ha ha." Jingyu looked at the contents of the letter. The smile in her eyes became bigger and bigger. She said with a smile, "Feng Maching is really smart. He got it so quickly. I thought it would take a long time." Chapter 2139. It's Hellion Theo who is too stupid. Xiaochen naturally knew what Jingyu was talking about. He frowned slightly. "Oh, but it's a pity that I didn't get to see how the two of them get along," Jingyu said with a faint smile. Xiaochen's face turned cold when he heard Jingyu's words. He said strangely, "What does it have to do with you how they get along?" Xiaochen was already unhappy that Jingyu was meddling in their affairs. Now that he heard Jingyu's words, he felt even more uncomfortable. "I'm just curious." "Husband, don't be angry." Jingyu sensed Xiaochen's unhappiness and immediately hugged Xiaochen's neck obediently. Xiaochen looked at Jingyu's fawning expression and snorted proudly. The displeasure on his face dissipated. "Linglan, Miaoqiu, and Suyu are all very curious. I'll write a letter to tell them." Jingyu seemed to have thought of something and excitedly went to write a letter. Xiaochen's body stiffened when he heard this. He silently mourned for Hellion Theo in his heart. It seemed that no one knew about this matter, but in fact, almost everyone knew about it. This woman was really irresistible when it came to gossiping. If Hellion Theo knew that Feng Maching actually made this matter known to everyone, he would definitely strangle Feng Maching to death. However, Hellion Theo didn't know about it for the time being. Feng Maching left for a month because of the matter at Sanluo Tower. When he returned, it was already spring. In 2 months, Xiaqing would give birth. During these few days, even if Hellion Theo didn't want to, he would still go to Xiaqing's palace to take a look. However, he only went to take a look. Why? Why doesn't the emperor want to look at me? Xiaqing was pregnant with a child and should have been plump, but she seemed to have lost weight. The sadness between her eyebrows couldn't dissipate. "Your Highness, please take care of your health," the palace maid beside her said worriedly when she saw Xiaqing in such a state. Take care. Take care. All of you are thinking about this child." Xiaqing had been suppressing her temper for a long time. Everyone who came to talk to her about the child, Xiaqing couldn't stand it anymore. Every time the emperor came, he would routinely ask about the child and nothing else. Xiaqing suddenly became very resentful. She suddenly remembered what happened with Hellion Theo in the bath. At that time, Hellion Xiu was so scary, but Xiaqing was wondering if she had done something wrong. Why did the emperor hate her so much? "Your Highness, please forgive us." The palace maids knelt on the ground and didn't dare to breathe loudly. "Let me ask you, has the emperor been to the other palace concubines these days?" Xiaqing suppressed the emotions in her heart and looked at the palace maids calmly. "Your Highness, the emperor hasn't been to any of your palaces. He has been dealing with government affairs. Occasionally, he would go to the West Side Hall to compete in martial arts or play chess with Tower Lord Feng." The palace maid quickly answered this time. "Tower Lord Feng?" Xiaqing frowned. She had heard this name often recently. Xiaqing naturally knew Tower Lord Feng's identity. However, in Xiaqing's opinion, she was just a boorish person who couldn't be seen in public. Chapter 2140. However, Xiaqing found it strange that His Majesty valued her so much. "Does His Majesty go there often?" Xiaqing pursed her lips slightly and said, "Speaking of which, His Majesty's great benefactor lives in this palace. As the master of this palace, I do have to go there and take a look. Make the arrangements tomorrow." "But Your Highness, your body." The palace maid was stunned when she heard Xiaqing's words. Then, she said worriedly, "It's fine. Isn't there still half a month before I give birth? I haven't gone out for a long time. Xiaqing looked at her big belly and said calmly, yes. The palace maid still wanted to comfort her, but when she saw Xiaqing's gaze, she immediately shrank back and responded respectfully. Hellion Theo was completely unaware that his actions had attracted Xiaqing's attention. The next day, Feng Maching was reading the news brought by his subordinates as usual. During this period of time, the underworld had begun to become active again. There were really a lot of killing jobs. Feng Maching felt that he had been idle for a long time. Should he also take on a mission and go out to kill people for fun? Feng Maching was looking at these missions with great interest when he heard that the imperial concubine had come to visit. Feng Maching was stunned. Why did the imperial concubine of Hellion Theo come to visit him? And this imperial concubine was pregnant, right? Feng Maching knew how important this child was to Hellion Theo. He thought that since it was Hellion Theo's child, it was naturally his child. Thinking of this, the corners of Feng Maching's mouth curled up. He seemed to anticipate that the scene of him raising a child with Hellion Theo in the future would be very interesting. Since the imperial concubine had come to visit, Feng Maching naturally wouldn't ignore her for the sake of Hellion Theo. With this thought, he stepped out and asked someone to invite the imperial concubine to the reception room. It wasn't the first time Feng Maching saw Xiaqing, but it was the first time Xiaqing saw Feng Maching. When she saw Feng Maching walk in from outside, Xiaqing was really stunned. Feng Maching was dressed in a dark purple robe. He didn't wear it in a formal manner, but he looked elegant. Greetings, imperial concubine. Feng Maching wasn't a member of the palace, so this salute was just a casual greeting. Lowering his head slightly was considered a greeting. Tower Lord Feng, you don't have to be so courteous. Xiaqing looked at Feng Maching's salute and felt a little unhappy in her heart. However, when she thought of the relationship between Feng Maching and Hellion Theo, she didn't say anything. This consort heard that Tower Master Feng has been staying in the palace for some time. This consort was pregnant and didn't have the time to visit. Didn't this consort finally have the time to come over today? I hope that Tower Master Feng won't take offense. Xiaqing's haughty manner made Feng Maching frown in displeasure. I wonder if Tower Lord Feng is used to living here? If there's anything, feel free to tell me. Xiaqing smiled generously. Imperial concubine Yang Yang is too polite. If this lord lacks anything, I will tell the emperor. There is no need to trouble imperial concubine Yang Yang. The ridicule in Feng Maching's words was very obvious. It was as if he was mocking the imperial concubine. He could see the emperor every day. Why would he need to tell her what he lacked? Xiaqing's expression suddenly turned ugly. She repeatedly told herself in her heart that this was a person of the pugilistic world. She couldn't lower herself to his level. Thinking of this, she felt a little better. Chapter 2141. Tower Master Feng is right. This consort spoke too much. Xiaqing said with a smile. This consort didn't know that Tower Master Feng and His Majesty are just benefactors. Why does this consort feel that His Majesty treats Tower Master Feng so differently? Hee. Feng Maching smiled coldly and said, Imperial Consort, why don't you ask His Majesty yourself? Tower Master Feng, don't misunderstand. This consort just wants to know more about His Majesty. I heard that His Majesty likes to come to Tower Master Feng's place. Xiaqing smiled gently and said, I haven't seen His Majesty being so attentive to any concubine. Tower Master Feng, did you hear what His Majesty said? So that's what Imperial Consort wants to ask. Feng Maching had an understanding look. There was a faint smile in his eyes as he said, His Majesty likes to practice martial arts. If there's a concubine who can compete with His Majesty, I think His Majesty will definitely like to go. That's right. It must be the feeling of suppressing His Majesty. Feng Maching's pitch-black eyes flickered with a very playful expression. That ambiguous expression stunned the imperial consort. She frowned strangely. Hearing Feng Maching's words, was he looking for someone who could beat His Majesty? That was His Majesty. Even if she could beat His Majesty in martial arts, she wouldn't dare to use her full strength. Wasn't this making things difficult for her? Xiaqing looked at Feng Maching and felt that he wasn't joking. Xiaqing asked a few more questions, but they were all dismissed by Feng Maching's unfathomable words. However, From Feng Maching's words, she could tell that when Feng Maching and His Majesty interacted, there were no rules between them. Feng Maching sent Xiaqing, who was full of worries, away and stood leisurely in front of the courtyard door. Was he too close to Hellion Theo and attracted attention? Since the imperial consort was here, it meant that almost everyone knew. It seemed a little troublesome, especially since Hellion Theo didn't even go to the concubine's place. If any rumors were to spread, someone come? Feng Maching thought for a moment and suddenly changed his order.
Tower Master.
A black shadow flashed out. Recently, if there are any killing jobs, take them all. This Tower Lord hasn't exercised for a long time. I'll go out and kill some people. Feng Maching curved his eyebrows and smiled. His words immediately caused the black-clothed man to widen his eyes. Tower Master, you're going to do it yourself? The black-clothed guard asked in astonishment. Can I? Feng Maching turned his head and asked calmly. Although he looked calm, his eyes were filled with coldness. This subordinate doesn't dare. The man in black quickly lowered his head and said, This subordinate will do it right away. Feng Maching's heart Feng Maching looked at. Seeing Hellion Theo's Machings, Feng Maching, his looked when he saw Hellion Theo. His seeing Theo's is that's right. Xiaqing came to see you? What did you talk about? Hellion Theo asked directly. Feng Maching looked at Hellion Theo's expression and laughed. Why? Are you afraid that I'll bully your concubine? Feng Maching asked with a faint smile. No. Hellion Theo lowered his head silently. He felt a little uncomfortable being stared at by Feng Maching. Don't worry, she doesn't know anything. I didn't say anything either. Feng Maching narrowed his eyes and replied. Chapter 2142. During this period of time, your concubine is about to give birth. You should move around more, don't let people gossip. Feng Maching raised his eyebrows casually. Hellion Theo was stunned when he heard Feng Maching's words, as if he found it strange. However, when he turned his head and saw that Feng Maching's expression didn't change, he silently pursed his lips and agreed. After that, Hellion Theo went to Xiaqing's palace frequently, but he never stayed overnight. His cold and indifferent expression didn't change, but it also seemed like something had changed. Xiaqing felt a little strange, and the emperor didn't say much. Only when Xiaqing asked about Feng Maching would Hellion Theo say a few more words. Your Majesty's relationship with Tower Lord Feng is really good, Xiaqing said as if she didn't care. Hellion Theo's eyes darkened slightly when he heard this. Why do you say that? Hellion Theo calmly raised the teacup in his hand and asked calmly. It's obvious from the way your Majesty and Tower Lord Feng are protecting each other. People who don't know would think that your Majesty cares about Tower Lord Feng, Xiaqing said. Hellion Theo's hand that was holding the teacup suddenly tightened. You can't speak carelessly. Hellion Theo stood up with a cold expression. Your Majesty, please forgive me. This concubine only feels that your Majesty cares about Tower Lord Feng more than this concubine. This concubine is pregnant with your Majesty's child, Xiaqing said with a little grievance, but she didn't see Hellion Theo's completely cold expression. Imperial concubine, is it because I'm too good to you? Hellion Theo turned and left after saying this, leaving Xiaqing bent over, her eyes filled with surprise. Imperial concubine, how can you say such things to the emperor? The palace maid beside her was also worried for Xiaqing. When she saw that Hellion Xiao had left, she said anxiously, Don't worry, Xiaqing. What's wrong with this concubine? Xiaqing frowned and said, I am the imperial concubine. How can the emperor always run to a man's courtyard? That may be the case, but the palace maid pursed her lips tightly as if she wanted to say something, but in the end, she didn't say anything. The imperial consort's actions today had clearly angered the emperor. All right, you may leave. This consort is tired. Xiaqing closed her eyes quietly. She was an imperial concubine and was pregnant with a dragon seed. Hellion Theo would definitely not do anything to her. After Hellion Theo came out of Xiaqing's palace, he turned around and went to the place where he usually checked the memorials. Looking at the memorials in his hand, a deep look appeared in his eyes. After a long silence, he still headed towards Feng Maching's residence. Not here. When Hellion Theo arrived, he was told that Feng Maching was not in the palace. Yes, the tower master received a mission and went out. The secret guard on duty said respectfully. Hellion Theo was silent for a moment, then turned and left. He was a little puzzled in his heart. Why did Feng Maching accept a mission? For half a month, Hellion Theo didn't even see Feng Maching's face. When he bumped into him by chance, Feng Maching had just returned from a mission and was very tired and had already fallen asleep. Hellion Theo didn't wake him up in the end. This kind of life continued until Xiaqing gave birth. In the palace, in Hellion Theo's bedroom, a midwife was brought to Hellion Theo. Hellion Theo was still wearing his dragon robe, exuding a noble aura. Chapter 21:43. This old servant greets your majesty. When the midwife saw Hellion Theo, she bowed respectfully. Are you the midwife in charge of the imperial consort's delivery? Hellion Theo turned around and looked at the midwife with a deep look in his eyes. His gaze made the midwife feel very uneasy. She lowered her head and carefully responded. I don't care what method you use for this delivery. I want the prince to be safe. Hellion Theo stared at the midwife with his pitch-black eyes and said, If anything happens to the prince, I will have your head. Rest assured, your majesty. This old servant will definitely ensure the safety of the mother and child. The midwife responded respectfully. Didn't I just say that I only want the prince to be safe? Do you understand? Hellion Theo repeated himself. When the midwife heard Hellion Theo's words, she was clearly stunned. Then, as if she thought of something, she instantly broke out in a cold sweat. She trembled and knelt on the ground. She forced herself to calm down and said, Rest assured, your majesty, this old servant will definitely ensure the prince's safety. Very good. Hellion Theo coldly turned around and said, I heard that you have a grandson. Bring him into the palace tomorrow. This old servant obeys. The midwife's face instantly turned pale. Her lips trembled and she respectfully kowtowed. When she left the room, she realized that her palms were covered in sweat. When the midwife walked away, she turned around to look at the palace she had just been in. She gripped her sleeves tightly, lowered her eyes, and turned around to leave without any expression. It had only been 3 to 5 days, and the imperial concubine was about to give birth. There were people coming and going in the palace. When Hellion Theo heard the news, he also came over. When he heard the screams in the room, his face sank. The child had been born for a long time, but there was still no news. Finally, after 6 hours, the midwife rushed out and said in a panic, Your Majesty, I'm afraid the imperial concubine won't be able to hold on. Save the child. Hellion Theo's face was cold. When he heard these words, there was no change in his expression. The concubines and palace maids waiting outside did not dare to breathe loudly. When they heard Hellion Theo's words, they were stunned. Suddenly, he felt a sense of sadness in his heart. This was the imperial family, who would care about the life and death of a concubine. At this moment, the one who was protected was the prince. The midwife's trembling body went in again. In the delivery room, Xiaqing's eyes were full of horror. She had tried her best to give birth to the child, but before she could even take a look at the child, she saw the midwife step forward and grab her hand. What are you doing? Xiaqing's eyes were filled with fear. Imperial concubine Yang, this old servant is also a servant. The midwife looked at Xiaqing and pursed her lips tightly. It's your fault. You said something you shouldn't have said. The prince is safe and sound. The emperor said he would bury you well. What? Xiaqing's eyes were full of horror. She struggled in disbelief, but the midwife came up and covered her mouth and nose with a piece of cloth. Ugh. Xiaqing struggled with her eyes wide open, but she had almost exhausted all her strength during the delivery. How could she escape? She suffocated deeply. Her eyes were full of unwillingness, and finally, she lost all her vitality. Chapter 21:44. When the other 3 people in the room saw this scene, they couldn't help but turn their heads away. However, since this was the emperor's order, they didn't dare to say anything. The midwife looked at Xiaqing's lifeless body with a trace of pity in her eyes. At this moment, she deeply felt that the emperor was heartless. The child had just been born, but the child's mother was killed by the father. How sad this was. The midwife was silent for a moment. Then, she gathered her emotions and walked out with the child in her arms. Your Majesty, Imperial Consort. The midwife knelt on the ground with a sorrowful face. When the crowd heard the midwife's words, their faces suddenly changed. Hellion Theo slowly stood up. There was a different look in his eyes. He slowly lowered his head and looked at the prince who was in front of him. Bury him as an imperial consort. Place the child in the side hall of my palace. I will raise him personally. Hellion Theo looked at the child in silence. Then, he looked at the concubines outside and left expressionlessly. From the beginning to the end, Hellion Theo didn't go in to see Xiaqing. What a cold-blooded and heartless emperor. After this incident, Hellion Theo's cold-blooded name spread. Xiaqing was favored and gave birth to a prince. In the end, she died a heroic death. The funeral was very grand. The northern pastoral prince was born. He was the first and last prince. From then on, Hellion Xiao never stepped into the imperial harem again. Some people said that Hellion Xiao was cold-blooded and heartless. Some people said that Hellion Xiao loved the imperial concubine deeply. In his heart, he missed the imperial concubine and was unwilling to be close to other imperial concubines. Especially when the crowd saw how Hellion Theo cared so much about the child. They felt that Hellion Theo still had feelings for the imperial consort. No matter what the outside world said, Hellion Theo never stood out to express his opinion. A month after the child was born, Hellion Theo immediately issued an imperial edict when the prince was 1 month old and crowned the child as the crown prince. There were voices all over the court, but Hellion Xiao was so strong that he did not back down at all. You're back. After Hellion Theo returned, he saw Feng Maching standing by the child's bed. He was slightly stunned. In the end, he said quietly. When Feng Maching heard Hellion Theo's voice, he turned to look. Yes, Feng Maching replied calmly. I didn't expect you to be so cruel. Feng Maching looked at Hellion Theo and said with a faint smile, Why didn't you keep Xiaqing? Nothing. Hellion Theo obviously didn't want to talk about this matter. He pursed his lips and said, Where did you go? Why did you take so long to come back? What? Did you miss me? Feng Maching reached out and hugged Hellion Theo. The way he leaned close to Hellion Theo instantly made Hellion Theo stiffen. He turned to look at the child on the bed and found that the child on the bed was staring at Feng Maching and Hellion Theo with a pair of pitch-black eyes. Stop fooling around. Hellion Theo broke free from Feng Maching's hand. Feng Maching looked at Hellion Theo's red face, and a faint smile appeared in his eyes. The two men lying on the bed in the room played with the child curiously. They held the child in their arms and had the same thought in their minds. Why did it feel like such a small child would die with a casual squeeze? Chapter 21:45. Their eyes were filled with smiles. The light that shone in from outside the window shone on the two of them. It was so dazzling. What are your plans for the future? Feng Maching stood by the corridor of the northern pastoral. Behind him was a group of palace maids and eunuchs. Feng Maching looked at the scenery of the northern pastoral and narrowed his eyes slightly. He turned his head to look at Hellion Theo beside him and asked, What about you? What are your plans? Hellion Theo did not answer. Instead, he turned his head to look at Feng Maching and asked. Feng Maching fell silent. Feng Maching, raise the child with me, Hellion Theo suddenly said. When Feng Maching heard Hellion Theo's words, the expression on his face suddenly became a little strange. He frowned tightly as if he was conflicted about something. He looked at Hellion Theo and asked, Then, when this child grows up, will he call me father or mother? You're not serious. Hellion Theo's cheeks immediately turned red when he heard this. Under the setting sun, the two of them stood side by side and their bodies were stretched very long. Feng Maching looked at the exquisite scenery in the distance with a calm expression in his eyes. This was the northern pastoral, where Hellion Theo lived. It was enough. Feng Maching, come and change the diaper. Hellion Theo was about to go crazy. This is what the child's mother wants to do. Feng Maching drank leisurely at the side. I'm going to kill you. In the room, Hellion Theo wanted to personally change the child's diaper. It was as if he wanted to tear the roof off the house. Feng Maching could not stand it anymore. When he walked over to help, the more he tried to help, the more trouble he caused. The two men struggled for a long time before they finally changed the child's diaper. Fortunately, the child was obedient today. If he was not obedient, he would probably cry and scream. It was tiring to have such parents. After that, the things that happened were endless. Feed, change, put to bed, and so on. This made Hellion Theo and Feng Maching realize how difficult it was to raise a child. They decisively threw the child to the wet nurse. Muda was sweating silently for his emperor. When Hellion Theo said that he wanted to take care of the children himself, Muda's heart was filled with worry. Now it seemed that his worry was right. Fortunately, the emperor still had self-awareness. Couldn't he just be a proper emperor? Eunuch Mu, why do you think the emperor is so close to brothel Lord Feng? As time passed, the news about Hellion Theo and Feng Maching gradually spread. However, this was the emperor's business. In the end, no one dared to spread it too much. A few ministers reported this matter, but they were scolded by Hellion Theo. Those who dared to insult Feng Maching were directly removed from their positions. A few years later, rumors began to circulate in the palace of the Northern Shepherds. It was as if the relationship between Hellion Xiao and Feng Maching had become a secret that everyone knew about, but no one dared to speak of. It was also a heavy stroke in the historical records. From then on, the emperor of the Northern Pastoral did not have any favored concubines. The position of the empress of the Northern Pastoral was empty. When Hellion Theo was 13 years old, Hellion Theo became the emperor's assistant. Bit by bit, he handed over the power in his hands to his son. When Hellion Yu was 18 years old, Hellion Theo announced his abdication. When Hellion Yu inherited the throne, Hellion Theo disappeared without a trace. In the beginning, there were people who asked about the late emperor. Later, there was no news at all. No one even knew if he was alive or dead. The Northern Pastoral was completely handed over to Hellion Yu. Feng Maching and Hellion Theo, it's over. Chapter 2146. As time passed, all living things changed with time. The king of Tokyo became the overlord of the world, ruling over the 4 seas and 8 directions. After a few years of stability, it seemed to have loosened a little. It had been nearly 8 years since Xiaochuan and Jingyu returned from Yaojiang. The imperial city of Tokyo was still bustling as before. The majesty of the magnificent gate of Prince Qingping's residence did not allow anyone to violate it. The departure of the 9th emperors and the 9th imperial concubine did not cause the prince's residence to be defeated. In fact, the prince's residence was even more high-profile than when Xiao Chun was still alive. Prince Qingping, Xiaobai, was now above tens of thousands of people and below one person. He was extraordinarily noble. Tomorrow is the Qiqiao festival. I heard that Prince Qingping is going to choose a consort. The weather in July was hot. Now, the streets and alleys were talking about Prince Qingping's consort. The men were curious, and the women were blushing. Prince Qingping, Xiaobai, had great power and wealth. He had no concubines or women in his residence. Most importantly, Prince Qingping was handsome. He was simply the first choice for a husband. Moreover, Prince Qingping was the adopted son of the 9th emperors and the 9th imperial concubine. In the general's residence, the empress was incomparably close to Prince Qingping, who didn't want to marry into the prince's residence. From then on, they could rest easy and live a life of luxury. However, Prince Qingping still had no intention of marrying a consort. Finally, this rumor was leaked this year. Immediately, all the women in the imperial capital who met the requirements boiled over. The Qiqiao festival was the place for the consort selection on the Linglong boat. Although there was no clear notice, everyone seemed to think that they must make a good impression in front of Prince Qingping on the Linglong boat. "Young lady, your noodles are here." A voice pulled the woman's thoughts back. It was a woman in plain clothes. There was a long sword on the table. Looking at her appearance, she seemed to be a person of Jianghu. In the Tokyo Imperial City, this waiter had seen many people of Jianghu. After placing the noodles in front of the woman, he turned and left. The noodles in the Imperial City are still so disgusting. The woman lifted her large cloak and veiled hat. After taking a bite, She put down her chopsticks in disgust. She turned her head slightly and saw an exquisite restaurant diagonally across the street. It was a majestic restaurant with the words "Come if you have money" written on it. It was said that this restaurant had been taken away by him. No wonder he had so much wealth. The woman lowered her head indifferently. She took out some money and put it down before she got up and left. She walked a few streets based on her memory before she stood in front of a mansion. She raised her head and looked at the plaque above the mansion. General's Mansion. Please pass on the message that Feng Yu is here to pay a visit to the general's wife. As she spoke, she lifted her veil, revealing her country-toppling beauty hidden under it. She seemed to have the charm of a foreign land, and her pitch-black eyes were so bright and moving. Feng Yu? Just as Feng Yu finished speaking, she heard a voice call out to her from behind. That steady voice caused Feng Yu to be slightly stunned. She turned around and saw the man who had just dismounted from his horse. He was dressed in black as usual. Big Brother Xing Er. Feng Yu looked at the man with a faint stubble. Her eyebrows slowly curved as she politely called out to him. It really is you. Second interrogation officer was clearly a little surprised as well. He looked Feng Yu up and down. That young and tender girl from back then had now grown into a slender and elegant woman. Her arched brows vaguely reminded him of her childhood. Chapter 2147. Why did you come to the Imperial City? Why didn't you tell me in advance? Xing Er's face was filled with joy as he said, Come in quickly. Feng Yu smiled faintly. Her current appearance could not be associated with the willful little witch from before. Xing Er said something to the guards and led Feng Yu into the residence. Daddy. Just as Feng Yu stepped in, she saw a little girl around 6 or 7 years old pouncing on Xing Er and hanging onto Xing Er's body. Junior, you're already so big. Come down quickly. Xing Er's eyes were filled with helplessness. Who's this big sister? The little girl hugging Xing Er was lying on Xing Er's shoulder. When she saw Feng Yu following behind Xing Er, she blinked her eyes in surprise. Her eyes were filled with amazement. Oh, I know. It's the little wife that Daddy brought back. The little girl looked as if she had been discovered. She quickly jumped off Xing Er's body and said loudly, I'm going to tell Mommy that Daddy cheated on her. Xing Er and Feng Yu's faces were filled with black lines. Xing Kejuan, get over here for this old lady. Just as Feng Yu was about to explain, she suddenly heard an angry shout. It was a woman in riding attire who rushed over with a horsewhip in her hand. Aya, we have guests. When the woman in riding attire saw second Xing and Feng Yu, she hurriedly hid the horsewhip in her hand behind her back. The way she changed her expression in that split second was simply breathtaking. Madam. Xing Er looked at Shangguan Linglan's appearance and helplessly held his forehead. Shangguan Linglan's face was still the same. She didn't seem to have changed much after so many years, but upon closer inspection, she seemed to have gained a hint of charm. The way she stood quietly still made her look like a noble lady, but Feng Yu was immune to it after experiencing the roar just now. Lawner, look who's here. Second Xing's face was also full of helplessness as he looked at Shangguan Linglan and said, This is... Shangguan Linglan was slightly taken aback when he heard Feng Yu's words. Then, he looked at Feng Yu carefully. Mother, this is father's new wife. The little girl, Xing Kejuan, rolled her eyes and walked out in a loud voice. Little girl, if you keep talking nonsense, I'll seal your mouth. Shangguan Linglan scowled at her words, scaring Xing Kejuan so much that she hid behind Xing Er. She pouted and said, Mother is so fierce. General Shangguan's charm is still the same as before. When Feng Yu saw this scene, she immediately laughed in amusement. She bowed slightly to Shangguan Linglan and said, Shangguan Linglan hadn't heard this title for many years, so he was stunned for a long time. He looked at Feng Yu and suddenly seemed to have discovered something. He called out in surprise, You are Feng Yu? Feng Yu greets madam. Feng Yu bowed slightly. It's really you. Aren't you in Miaojiang? Why did you suddenly come to the Imperial City? Why didn't you tell me in advance? Please come in. Feng Yu's arrival made Shangguan Linglan surprised. This is my daughter, Xing Kejuan. Shangguan Linglan touched Xing Kejuan's head and said to Feng Yu, I know. Where's the young master? Feng Yu said with a slight smile. Chapter 2148. Rui is at the horse farm. Shangguan Linglan stepped forward and held Feng Yu's hand affectionately. He said to Xing Kejuan, "Go, call Xing Kerue over." "Got it." Xing Kejuan looked at Feng Yu curiously and then quickly ran away. Shangguan Linglan pulled Feng Yu to sit down helplessly. Her manner of asking this and that made Feng Yu a little helpless. She casually said that she had been in Miaojiang for a long time, and this time she had just come out. "Is Miaojiang okay?" Shangguan Linglan naturally knew about Miaojiang and knew that Feng Yu was the chief of Miaojiang. Yes, the people of Miaojiang can live and work in peace. Right now, there are some trivial matters in Miaojiang. I let Brother Ling take care of it. I came out to travel the world. I passed by here from the northern pastoral, so I came to see Madam. No need to be so polite. Call me Aunt Lan like Xiaobai. Shangguan Linglan said very kindly. Aunt Lan. Feng Yu silently called out. Normally, Feng Yu shouldn't call her aunt. However, since Shangguan Linglan said so, Feng Yu naturally couldn't refuse. You and Xiao Chun are not in the imperial city. I'm sure you know that too? Shangguan Linglan looked at Feng Yu and said, Yes, I only found out after entering the imperial city. I haven't been out of Miaojiang for so long. I'm not up to date with the news. They are in the Roman forest. Without someone to lead the way, I really don't dare to go alone. Feng Yu said helplessly. How about this? Shangguan Linglan slightly pursed his lips and said, Stay here for a few more days. I'll let Xing send you a message. Feng Yu was slightly dazed. She quickly waved her hand and said, It's okay, Aunt Lan. I'll go somewhere else in a few days. It won't be too late to talk about it then. That won't do. Shangguan Linglan suddenly said with a face of displeasure. It's the Crown Prince's birthday soon. Aren't you going to see Aunt Xiao? All right. Feng Yu frowned slightly. She didn't want to stay in the imperial city for too long, but since she had come to see Shangguan Linglan, she naturally wanted to see Lu Miaoqiu as well. Moreover, Feng Yu couldn't refuse Shangguan Linglan's hospitality. Shangguan Linglan looked at Feng Yu and nodded with satisfaction. Mother, are you looking for me? Just as Shangguan Linglan and Feng Yu were talking, a crisp voice rang out from the door. Feng Yu turned her head and saw a boy striding in. He looked about 6 or 7 years old, and his facial features were 70% similar to Xing Kejuan's. Rui, come here. This is your big sister Feng Yu. Shangguan Linglan beckoned Xing Kerue over. Sister Yu. Xing Kerue's eyes curiously landed on Feng Yu's body. She nodded slightly at Feng Yu in an indifferent manner and did not say anything else. That's right, Feng Yu, you don't have any relatives in the imperial city. Why don't you stay in the general's residence? Shangguan Linglan looked at Xing Kerue's indifferent manner and frowned in displeasure. Then, he seemed to have thought of something and said to Feng Yu. Feng Yu naturally didn't have the face to say that she wanted to stay in an inn and could only nod her head in agreement. This made Shangguan Linglan extremely happy. He called for people to help Feng Yu settle down and said that Feng Yu should have a good rest after such a long journey. The general's residence seemed to have become even more lively. After settling Feng Yu down, Shangguan Linglan hurriedly tugged at Xing and said, Husband, quickly send someone to send a message to King Qingping's residence. Xing looked at Shangguan Linglan and frowned in confusion as he asked, Send a message to King Qingping's residence for what? Chapter 2149. You blockhead. Shangguan Linglan glared at Xing in disdain and said, Don't ask so many questions. Send someone to tell Xiaobai that he must go to the Ling Long boat in 3 days. If he doesn't go, don't call me Aunt Lan anymore. Shangguan Linglan threw down these words and walked away with his chin held high, leaving Xing behind. He rubbed his forehead as he felt a headache coming on. He didn't know what Shangguan Linglan wanted to do. However, he naturally had to listen to his wife's words. He waved his hand and called for someone to repeat Shangguan Linglan's words. Late at night, Prince Qingping's mansion. News from the general's mansion? Asking this king to go to the Ling Long boat? The man who was leaning on the tall chair was completely hidden in the shadows. His faint voice was filled with doubt, and it was hoarse and moving.
Yes.
The person who spoke was none other than Interrogation Officer 11. What is Aunt Lan doing now? Xiaobai sighed helplessly. He raised his hand slightly and said, "This king already knows. It's just a Ling-Long boat. So what if he goes? This subordinate will go and prepare now." Interrogation Officer 11 responded and left, his heart filled with emotions. In the imperial city, there were only two people who could move the prince. The first was naturally Shangguan Linglan. The other, needless to say, was Lu Miaoqiu. Once these two made a move, the prince wouldn't even give face to the emperor. However, these two could make the prince compromise with just a few words. The lights in the room flickered. The man with his chin exposed was dressed in embroidered robes. Feng Yu woke up early in the morning and strolled around the general's mansion. Unknowingly, she walked to the edge of the martial arts field. From afar, she saw a family of 4 practicing martial arts on the field. The 2 little children were practicing martial arts with Shangguan Linglan and Xing Er. Feng Yu found this scene to be very interesting, and the corners of her mouth curled up slightly. "Xiao Yu, you're up so early?" Shangguan Linglan was wearing a tight-fitting riding suit. He wiped his sweat and walked towards Feng Yu with a faint smile in his eyes. "Not as early as Auntie Lan and the rest of you." Feng Yu smiled faintly and said very gently. Shangguan Linglan laughed and said that he was used to it. He let someone take Feng Yu to eat while he washed his face and rinsed his mouth. He changed his clothes and appeared in front of Feng Yu again. This time, he was wearing proper clothes and had an imposing manner. "Feng Yu, you came at the right time. In 3 days, it will be the Qiqiao festival. At that time, I will bring you to the Ling-Long boat to take a look." Shangguan Linglan said indifferently. "Ah, no need, no need." When Feng Yu heard Shangguan Linglan's words, she immediately waved her hand and said, "What are you talking about?" Shangguan Linglan said with a slight smile in his eyes, "Since I'm here, I'll naturally go and have some fun." Why? Was he afraid of seeing Xiaobai on the boat? Don't worry, he is Prince Qingping. He won't go. No, I just don't like so many people. Feng Yu was exposed by Shangguan Linglan and immediately lowered her head a little uncomfortably. "Haha, Jun and Rui will also go. Don't worry." When Shangguan Linglan said this, although Feng Yu was unwilling, she could only helplessly agree. Since Xiaobai wouldn't go, then she would go and take a look. Thinking that Xiaobai wouldn't go, Feng Yu breathed a sigh of relief but also felt a little disappointed. It had been 8 years. Feng Yu's expression was a little absent-minded, but she silently lowered her head. Chapter 2150. Come, change your clothes and accompany me to the streets to buy some things. After Shangguan Linglan finished eating, he pulled Feng Yu's hand and said, "You should have come earlier. In this imperial city, no one can accompany me to the streets." After Shangguan Linglan said this, he looked at Xing Er with a resentful expression. The resentment in his eyes made Xing Er cough repeatedly. He raised his hand to cover his mouth and said, "I still have official business to take care of. You guys have fun." After saying this, he immediately fled. "This is?" Feng Yu looked at this scene and a faint smile appeared in her eyes. Looking at Shangguan Linglan's depressed but helpless expression, the corners of her mouth curved into a smile. "Let's go." Shangguan Linglan pulled Feng Yu to change into an official's young lady's clothes and went to the streets. "Xiao Yu hasn't been back for so many years. Do you feel that something has changed in the imperial city?" Shangguan Linglan looked at Feng Yu. Feng Yu was looking at the streets outside the carriage with the curtains open. When she heard Shangguan Linglan's words, she slowly put down the curtains in her hands. "There's a big change." Feng Yu faintly lowered her eyes and said, "It's more prosperous. I haven't lived in the imperial city for long, but I know that the southwest side wasn't as prosperous before. Now, it's bustling like this." "Yes." Shangguan Linglan slightly nodded and said, "In the past, there were a lot of poor people there. However, after Xiaobai found out about it, he developed it into a commercial area in half a year. Now, all the shops there are owned by Xiaobai. He's very powerful." Feng Yu was silent for a moment and said very calmly, "Yes, compared to the 9 emperors, he's more suitable here." Shangguan Linglan looked at Feng Yu's absent-minded expression and silently closed his mouth. He faintly raised his eyebrows and a faint joy appeared in his eyes. When the two arrived at the downtown area, they got off the carriage. Although Shangguan Linglan and Feng Yu weren't weak women, it was still inconvenient for them to wear skirts. Thus, they still brought along 2 bodyguards when they went out. At this moment, they were walking on the street. Walking on this street, one could casually hear things about the Qiqiao festival and Prince Qingping. Even if Feng Yu wanted to ignore it, she couldn't. He was already so outstanding now. He was so outstanding that it made people raise their eyebrows. Feng Yu was silent for a moment before she lowered her eyes. Just as she was lost in thought, someone accidentally bumped into her. Feng Yu's body staggered for a moment before she steadied herself. Only then did she look up and see that the person who bumped into her was a veiled woman. The woman frowned. When she turned her head to look at Feng Yu, she was slightly stunned. Her pair of pitch-black, gem-like eyes flashed with light. She seemed to want to say something, but suddenly turned her head and ran away under Feng Yu's astonished gaze. Feng Yu stood in place, her eyes full of doubt. She didn't say anything just now, right? Why did this girl turn around and run away as if she was frightened? Feng Yu helplessly shook her head and didn't think too much about it. When she heard Shangguan Linglan's call, she hurriedly walked over. Seeing Shangguan Linglan helping her choose jewelry and clothes, she felt very helpless in her heart, but she was also somewhat moved. Seeing Shangguan Linglan's excited appearance and almost walking through the streets, Feng Yu naturally wouldn't say anything that would dampen his spirits. Chapter 2151. We've been walking for a long time. You must be hungry. Let's go and eat, Shangguan Linglan said as he pulled Feng Yu's hand. Feng Yu's heart skipped a beat when she heard this. The first thought in her mind was that Shangguan Linglan wasn't going to bring her to eat at Richlai, right? As soon as Feng Yu thought of this, she saw Shangguan Linglan pulling her toward Richlai restaurant. Looking at his posture, it was obvious that he was going to eat. Feng Yu heard that Richlai restaurant was bought by Xiaobai, right? Don't be nervous. Shangguan Linglan patted Feng Yu's hand comfortingly and said, eating here is free. I'm also saving money for Xing Air. Feng Yu's face suddenly darkened when she heard this. She helplessly lowered her head and let Shangguan Linglan pull her in. Feng Yu ate this meal in fear. But when she was about to finish eating, Feng Yu suddenly froze. What was she afraid of? Xiaobai. She didn't do anything shameful. So what if she met Xiaobai? As Feng Yu thought about it, she suddenly smiled. She felt that her thoughts and actions were laughable. She seemed to have figured out what was going on in her heart, and her appetite improved. When she calmly put down her chopsticks, she saw Shangguan Linglan staring at her. Aunt Lan, is there something on my face? Feng Yu reached out slightly and wiped her cheek. No. Shangguan Linglan immediately waved her hand and said, I'm just thinking that I really can't find any trace of little Feng Yu's appearance in you. Hee hee. Feng Yu said with a light smile, Aunt Lan, I'm the leader of Miaojiang. No matter in front or behind people, I have to learn etiquette. It's just that Miaojiang's etiquette is a bit different from yours. Shangguan Linglan naturally knew what Feng Yu meant. He smiled calmly and said, I know. I'm just thinking about it. You've endured so much at such a young age. It must have been hard in Miaojiang these past few years, right? I won't. Feng Yu arched her eyebrows slightly and said, I have Brother Ling to accompany me. Silly girl. Shangguan Linglan chuckled. Aunt Lan, on the other hand, seems to have changed a lot. Feng Yu looked at Shangguan Linglan and blinked slightly. In Feng Yu's memory, the impression that Shangguan Linglan gave her was still the memory of a general clad in iron armor and 10,000 soldiers. But now, the difference was huge. In the age of peace, I'm just the mother of an ordinary child. Shangguan Linglan naturally knew what Feng Yu meant. He smiled calmly. While Shangguan Linglan and Feng Yu were talking about the past, a surprised voice suddenly interrupted them. Sister Lan? A gentle voice sounded from the side. Shangguan Linglan turned his head and saw the figure walking over. The man was dressed in a navy blue robe that accentuated his slender figure. Yijuan, why are you here? Shangguan Linglan naturally recognized the person who was walking over. On his handsome face, there was a hint of scholarly aura. However, there was also a sense of steadiness. His face had become even more mature. I just finished eating with a few scholars. I didn't expect to meet Sister Lan here. Xiao Yijuan stood in front of Shangguan Linglan. Chapter 2152. That pair of smiling eyes seemed to soften in an instant. What a coincidence. I brought Xiao Yu out to buy things. Shangguan Linglan smiled and said, You know each other from before, right? Long time no see, Xiao Yijuan. Only then did Feng Yu slowly stand up. That slender and elegant figure bowed slightly to Xiao Yijuan. Such a pleasant voice, so familiar, yet somewhat unfamiliar. Xiao Yijuan stared at Feng Yu for a long time, then suddenly smiled. That bright smile, a smile that came from the heart, stunned Feng Yu. You're back. There wasn't much greeting, but this sentence suddenly warmed Feng Yu's heart. There was a faint smile in her eyes. Feng Yu wanted to say that she was temporarily back, but seeing Xiao Yijuan's gaze, she could only silently swallow the words in her mouth. After the three of them sat down again, they continued to talk. Yijuan, why did you come out instead of assisting the crown prince in the palace? After Shangguan Linglan finished speaking, he turned to look at Feng Yu and said, Yijuan is now the grand tutor, the crown prince's teacher. He is very powerful. I already knew how powerful he is, Feng Yu replied with a faint smile. I remembered that I still have to buy things for Xing'er. How could I forget? Shangguan Linglan said as he stood up and said, You all sit here first. I will be back soon. Sister Lan, don't worry. I will take good care of Feng Yu. Xiao Yijuan agreed. Shangguan Linglan smiled and responded a few times before leaving. Feng Yu sat down again and slightly tilted her head to look out the window. Suddenly, she realized that the atmosphere had changed. Have you been well these past few years? Xiao Yijuan asked Feng Yu with arched brows. Pretty good. Feng Yu nodded quietly and said, It's a peaceful time. How can it not be good? I often hear people say that Miaojiang is good, but I never had the chance to see it. Xiao Yijuan looked quietly at Feng Yu and asked, This time, do you plan to stay in the imperial city for a long time? Never planned. Feng Yu shook her head slightly and said, After the crown prince's birthday, I will go back. Hearing this, Xiao Yijuan's brows furrowed slightly, then relaxed and said, Have you gone to see Sister Yu? The elder Sister Yu that Xiao Yijuan was referring to was naturally Jing Yu. Feng Yu shook her head lightly and replied, Let's meet her on the way back. Xiao Yijuan also responded. The two of them chatted here and there, but they no longer felt as close as before. Although it was not to the point of awkwardness, it was still a little uncomfortable. Xiao Yijuan tilted his head and looked out of the window. Shangguan Linglan had not returned for a long time. Xiao Yijuan turned his head helplessly and said, Sister Lan is always like this. It's getting late. I'll send you back. Are you staying in the general's residence now? Yes, I remember the way back to the residence. There is no need to send me off. Feng Yu also stood up and blinked as she spoke to Xiao Yijuan. Haha. When Xiao Yijuan heard Feng Yu's words, he immediately laughed in amusement and said, You have really changed a lot. Although the journey is short, let me send you off. All right. Feng Yu silently lowered her head. At the side of the carriage, Xiao Yijuan reached out and helped Feng Yu into the carriage. His warm hand made Feng Yu's lowered face blush slightly. In the carriage, the two of them sat facing each other but did not say anything. Chapter 2153. Feng Yu. In front of the general's estate, Xiao Yijuan looked at Feng Yu's figure and pursed his lips. Feng Yu stopped in her tracks and blinked in confusion as she turned around. Will you be going to the Qiqiao festival? Xiao Yijuan stood by the side of the carriage with his hands behind his back. He had a gentle appearance as he looked at Feng Yu with clear eyes and asked with a gentle gaze. Yes, I will be going. Feng Yu was a little confused. Why did Xiao Yijuan ask this? But she still answered calmly. Xiao Yijuan smiled when he heard Feng Yu's answer. He said, That's good. Then, he left with his people. Feng Yu was puzzled as she stood there. She then shook her head helplessly. Only after returning home did she find out that Xing Kajuan had fallen. Fortunately, she didn't fall anywhere and only hit her elbow. No wonder Shangguan Linglan had rushed back in such a hurry. Feng Yu asked about it. After finding out that she was fine, she let out a sigh of relief. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. When Feng Yu was free, She would instruct Xing Kurue on the martial arts field. Xing Kurue was very smart and could learn martial arts in one go. In the past few days, he would also reveal a faint smile when facing Fengyu. Fengyu looked at Xing Kurue and smiled helplessly. She was exactly the same as Xing Er when he was young. During the Qiqiao festival, all the lovers in the world would light up lanterns. This Tokyo Imperial City was very lively. The sky wasn't dark yet, but the streets were already crowded. Before Fengyu went out, she changed into a very beautiful dress. "Aunt Lan, do I really have to wear this?" Fengyu asked with a frown. "That's natural. Who knows how many beautiful young ladies are vying for attention today? You naturally can't fall behind." Shangguan Linglan replied with a deadpan expression. Fengyu really wanted to say that she didn't want to attract attention. Back then, your Aunt Lan was one of the top beauties in the Imperial City. Shangguan Linglan excitedly talked about her and Jingyu, as well as Lu Miaoqiu, but she lowered her voice towards the end. "Now that we have our own families, I really miss the old days." Shangguan Linglan inserted the last hairpin into Fengyu's black hair and nodded with satisfaction. "Tonight, you will definitely be the center of attention, Aunt Lan." Fengyu only thought that Shangguan Linglan was joking, but she didn't expect that tonight. He was truly the center of attention. By the time Fengyu was done tidying up, the sky outside was already dark. Fengyu slowly stood up. She was dressed in gorgeous clothes, and with her slightly powdered face, she was truly beautiful. After walking out of the door, Xing Kejuan kept circling around Fengyu. Fengyu smiled faintly and followed Shangguan Linglan out of the residence. Everywhere was brightly lit, and there was a hubbub of voices. She was really afraid that she would be pushed away by the crowd. Xing Er and Shangguan Linglan walked in front. Fengyu saw how Xing Er protected Shanghai Linglan, and a trace of gentleness appeared in her eyes. She watched as Shanghai Linglan looked around, not caring about the surroundings. She probably knew that he was behind her. "Xiao Yu." Just as Fengyu was letting her imagination run wild, she heard Shangguan Linglan's call. She immediately quickened her steps and walked to Shangguan Linglan's side. "Over there is the Ling Long boat that we are going to." Shangguan Linglan raised his hand and pointed. On the wide riverbank, there was a very large boat. Fengyu turned her head to look, and a trace of surprise appeared in her eyes. Chapter 2154. This was probably the most gorgeous ship Fengyu had ever seen. Fengyu's eyes became absent-minded for a moment. Suddenly, she thought of the time when she went out to sea in Yangzhou. At that moment, everything suddenly became so clear. It was as if the memory that had been sealed for a long time had been loosened for a moment. "Little Yu, why are you in a daze?" Shangguan Linglan took a few steps and turned around to look at Fengyu, who was still standing at the same spot. He immediately called out to her in confusion. "It's nothing. I'm coming." Fengyu slightly clenched her fists and slowly lowered her eyes. Shangguan Linglan brought Fengyu to walk around before bringing her onto the ship. Xing Er naturally didn't follow Shangguan Linglan and the other women. The two of them separated at the entrance. Xing Er walked towards his colleagues, while Shangguan Linglan brought Fengyu into the circle of women. They enthusiastically introduced Fengyu as their niece. Fengyu lowered her head and greeted them one by one. After a while, she slowly sat down at the side. Around her were women of the same age, but the way they spoke made Fengyu feel somewhat out of place. Fengyu only faintly smiled at the side. If someone spoke to her, she would quietly reply. On this ship, there was already a small group of people. After a while, Fengyu propped her head up and looked at the brightly lit shore. Colorful lanterns floated on the surface of the river. There were many people walking on the riverbank. Some of them were walking while holding hands. Fengyu was lost in thought. Just as Fengyu was lost in thought, she heard a series of exclamations. "Heavens! That's Prince Qingping! Prince Qingping really came! It really is Prince Qingping! Prince Qingping!" Words sounded in her ears. Fengyu's hand unconsciously tightened around her cup. Her head was still lowered, and she didn't dare to raise it. "Why is there a woman beside Prince Qingping?" "Yeah, who is that woman? He seems to be very close to Prince Qingping." When Fengyu heard this, she was immediately stunned. The wine cup in her hand suddenly loosened and fell onto the table. Fengyu hurriedly caught it. Fortunately, the people around her were attracted by Xiaobai and no one noticed. Feng Yu carefully wiped her hands. Then, he calmly raised his eyes. There was almost no need to identify him at all. He could clearly see the dazzling figure in the crowd. It was as if everyone around him was dim and dull. He was wearing a black robe with embroidered edges. His slightly furrowed brows made him look even more unapproachable. This aura was somewhat similar to Xiao Qin's, but the difference was that Xiao Qin's temperament was originally cold, while Xiaobai's was not. His displeased appearance seemed to be because he did not like being so noisy. His increasingly mature appearance caused Feng Yu's heart to feel as if it had received a heavy blow. He hurriedly lowered his head and slowly suppressed the uncomfortable beating in his heart. Then, he slowly calmed down. Heavens! Prince Qingping is walking over. He's walking over. The few women beside Feng Yu suddenly became excited. Feng Yu's heart trembled fiercely. Prince Qingping is walking over. These girls? Shangguan Linglan smiled helplessly as he looked at the girls beside him. Aunt Lan. Xiaobai walked closer and calmly called out to her in a very pleasant voice. Chapter 2155. The cold expression on her face slowly softened when she saw Shangguan Linglan. Shangguan Linglan stood up, and the group of young ladies by her side also stood up and bowed. You're still obedient. What's wrong? Why did you come with such a big lineup? Shangguan Linglan looked at Xiaobai and smiled, then asked calmly. The banquet is about to start. I want to keep Yun Yun by your side. Xiaobai said as she turned her body slightly. A young woman walked out from behind Xiaobai. She had a cute face and a pair of watery eyes that seemed to be able to speak. Auntie Lan. Who else could it be but Yun Yun when she looked so similar? Yun Yun? Why did you come to the Imperial City? Shangguan Linglan naturally knew Yun Yun. She had seen Yun Tian's daughter before. I haven't seen Big Brother Xiaobai for 2 years. This time, I snuck out without telling my parents. Aunt Lan, you're not allowed to tell my parents. Yun Yun intimately went up and hugged Shangguan Linglan's arm as she smiled. You're so naughty. Shangguan Linglan was stunned when she heard this. Then she helplessly glared at Yun Yun. Then I'll have to trouble Aunt Lan. Xiaobai's eyes were also filled with helplessness. In the end, she slightly restrained her expression and said, Okay, I know. Shangguan Linglan nodded in response. Suddenly, she seemed to have thought of something and said, Oh right, there's another person I want you to meet. Shangguan Linglan turned around and wanted to call Feng Yu out. However, when he turned around, he didn't see Feng Yu's figure. Where is she? Shangguan Linglan looked at the empty table behind her and blinked in confusion. Xiaobai looked at Shangguan Linglan's appearance and shook her head slightly, then said, We'll talk later. I'll go first. Big brother Xiaobai, come pick me up. Seeing that Xiaobai was about to leave, Yun Yun hurriedly said. Xiaobai nodded slightly when he heard this. Without saying anything, he turned around and left. He completely did not see the slender figure hidden in the darkness within the crowd behind him. The Ling Long boat started to get lively. Almost all the girls were looking at Xiaobai, but Xiaobai just sat there silently from the beginning to the end. He turned a blind eye to the countless girls' attention. The sound of music rose from all directions, and the sounds of laughter and riddles were so lively. However, the place where Feng Yu was standing seemed to be out of place. Feng Yu did not turn her head. She looked at the sparkling water surface with a calm expression in her eyes. Feng Yu. A voice rang out from behind her. Feng Yu turned around and saw Xiao Yijuan, who was wearing an azure robe, standing behind her with an elegant demeanor. He held a flower lantern in his hand and looked at her with a gentle smile. I just won it. I'll give it to you, Xiao Yijuan said as he handed the lantern in his hand to Feng Yu. Thank you. Feng Yu seemed to be surprised for a moment. Then, her eyebrows slightly curved as she took the lantern from Xiao Yijuan's hand. Xiao Yijuan watched Feng Yu take the lantern and immediately smiled. Feng Yu found his happy expression very funny. Why are you so happy? Feng Yu arched her eyebrows and smiled. The smile that crept up her face seemed to make all the lights around her pale in comparison. Only then did Feng Yu smile, but she suddenly realized that it had suddenly become quiet. Chapter 2156. Feng Yu was slightly taken aback. Before she could figure out what had happened, she saw Xiao Yijuan turn his body slightly to the side. A pitch-black figure was standing quietly beside Xiao Yijuan. Feng Yu's grip on the flower lantern tightened instantly. The pair of dark eyes staring at her flickered with countless emotions under the light of the lantern. Feng Yu could not understand the emotions in those eyes, but Feng Yu's heart tightened fiercely the moment she saw those eyes. Xiaobai had never dreamed that their next meeting would be in such a situation. He hated such occasions. Xiaobai had been sitting silently the entire time, but inadvertently saw Xiao Yijuan. Just as he was about to raise his cup to Xiao Yijuan, he saw that the Grand Tutor had actually guessed a lantern riddle and won a lantern. Xiaobai watched with great interest, thinking about which family's girl Xiao Yijuan had taken a fancy to. He could go back and have a good chat with his mother. As he thought of this, Xiaobai saw Xiao Yijuan walk around everyone and walk to the side of a girl standing at the edge of the boat in the distance. That slender and small figure caused his eyes to change slightly, and he was actually stunned for a moment. Before he could figure out what was going on, he saw the woman who was standing with her back to him slowly turn around. That incomparably familiar face leaped into his eyes. That slightly moving lips and that fleeting smile appeared on her face. In an instant, it hit Xiaobai hard on the chest, causing him to abruptly stand up. That appearance that was almost engraved into his bones had not dissipated in the slightest in 8 years. Instead, as time passed, it made his thoughts go wild bit by bit. After a brief moment of shock, Feng Yu slowly suppressed the chaotic thoughts in her heart. She clearly noticed that the surrounding gazes were looking at her. If she did not say anything, this situation was really, the lantern, is very beautiful. Feng Yu opened her mouth slightly and smiled at Xiao Yijuan. Then, she turned to look at Xiaobai. After a moment of silence, she lowered her head and said, "Prince Qingping, I've heard a lot about you." That polite and distant manner, as if she did not want to acknowledge him at all, caused Xiaobai's expression to turn ugly bit by bit. "I'm just passing by. I'll leave first. You guys continue." Feng Yu felt that if she continued to stay here, something big would definitely happen. Therefore, she hurriedly said those words, turned around and walked towards the stern of the boat. The boat was already nearing the shore. With her qinggong, this distance was naturally not a problem. "Stop right there." Just as Feng Yu was about to move, Xiaobai shot forward and blocked Feng Yu's path. Feng Yu looked at the suddenly approaching Xiaobai and immediately took a step back in panic. Her body was a little stiff as she looked at Xiaobai and said, "Is there anything else? Is this how you treat me?" Xiaobai moved closer to Feng Yu. Feng Yu could clearly smell the clear scent on Xiaobai's body. I'm not a Tokyo. I don't know Tokyo etiquette." Feng Yu awkwardly took a step back, only to find that her back was pressed against the edge of the boat. Feng Yu slightly tilted her head to look at the drinking water below and helplessly frowned. When did they arrive? Xiaobai stared at Feng Yu for a long time before asking. In the end, he stopped in his tracks and did not take another step forward. 2 days ago." Feng Yu slightly pursed her lips and replied, her eyes flickering. Chapter 2157. Feng Yu didn't notice that after she sat down, Xiao Yijuan's deep and cold gaze landed on her from the other side. The emotions in his eyes were very different. Then, he slowly lowered his head and didn't say anything. "Big sister Feng Yu?" Just as Feng Yu was thinking, a very happy voice sounded. Feng Yu was slightly taken aback. She raised her head and saw a beautiful woman standing in front of her. Her curved eyes seemed to be pleasantly surprised as she looked at her. "You are." Feng Yu looked at the familiar face in front of her, and the expression on her face quickly changed. She said in surprise, "You are Yun Yun?" "Big sister Feng Yu. You still remember me." When Yun Yun heard Feng Yu accurately call out her name, her eyes instantly widened in surprise. Before Feng Yu could react, Yun Yun threw herself into her arms. "Big sister Feng Yu. That's great. Yun missed you so much." Yun Yun's eyes were filled with gratitude as she spoke. The excitement in her tone made Feng Yu's lips curl up as well. During the banquet, Feng Yu finally felt a lot more at ease because of Yun Yun. Yun Yun kept holding Feng Yu's hand and talked about where she had been all these years. In the beginning, She wanted to go back to the prince's mansion and so on. Feng Yu sat at the side and listened quietly. When she heard Yun Yun's words, she suddenly felt envious. Yun Yun was really carefree. When the banquet was about to end, Feng Yu and Yun Yun stood up reluctantly. Big sister Feng Yu, are you staying at Aunt Lan's place now?
Yun Yun blinked and asked.
Yes, why?
Feng Yu nodded lightly.
Oh, Yun Yun said unhappily, I want to stay with big sister Feng Yu. After Yun Yun said this, Feng Yu was instantly stunned. She lowered her head helplessly and didn't know what to say. After a moment of silence, she was about to say something to comfort Yun Yun when she saw Xiao Bai walking over from the corner of her eyes. Big brother Xiao Bai. Yun Yun saw Xiao Bai appear and immediately called out happily. Yes. Xiao Bai glanced at Yun Yun before his gaze landed on Feng Yu. Xiao Bai's eyes fell silent for a moment when he saw Feng Yu standing quietly on the spot with her head lowered in an obedient manner. In his memory, Feng Yu was not like this. She had changed. Big brother Xiao Bai, I want to live with big sister Feng Yu. Yun Yun looked at Xiao Bai with grievance. Xiao Bai was stunned when he heard this and turned to look at Shangguan Linglan. Big brother Xiao Bai, how about letting big sister Feng Yu stay in the Wangfu? Anyway, there are so few people in your mansion. Yun Yun suddenly thought of something and asked Xiao Bai in surprise. When Feng Yu heard Yun Yun's words, her eyes widened in shock. What? Feng Yu's eyes were filled with surprise. All right. Xiao Bai agreed without even thinking about it. Feng Yu's breathing suddenly stopped, and she turned to look at Xiao Bai. Xiao Bai was also looking at Feng Yu. He was just thinking about how to meet Feng Yu again. Since Yun Yun made such a suggestion, Xiao Bai naturally agreed unconditionally. Aunt Lan shouldn't have any objections, right? Xiao Bai casually looked at Shangguan Linglan. Shangguan Linglan looked at Xiao Bai, who was like a fox. Chapter 2158. The corners of her mouth twitched violently. Just as she was about to speak, Xing Er suddenly grabbed her. No objections. Feng Yu will be in your care. After Xing Er finished his sentence, he turned around and left with Shangguan Linglan in his arms. Shangguan Linglan was stunned in Xing Er's arms. She was at a loss as she opened her mouth to speak. However, she was dragged away by Xing Er. Feng Yu wanted to stop Shangguan Linglan, but just as she took a step forward, she was blocked by Xiao Bai. The general's mansion does not welcome you. Leave with this king. Xiao Bai said it so casually, but Feng Yu felt as if something was stuck in her throat. She couldn't get it out, nor could she swallow it. Feng Yu never thought that she would be in such a state when she returned to the mansion. She stood beside the horse carriage and looked at the familiar door and plaque. Feng Yu's face was filled with a complicated expression.
Come in.
When Xiao Bai turned around, he saw Feng Yu, who was still standing at the same spot. His eyes involuntarily became a little gentler as he calmly opened his mouth and called out. Feng Yu withdrew her gaze and quietly acknowledged before striding into the manor. The mansion seemed to have suddenly become lively. Xiao Bai lay on the bed and looked at the top of the bed. He thought about the person he had been missing. She was sleeping in the mansion, and he would be able to see her tomorrow morning. Xiao Bai suddenly felt a warm current flowing through his heart. This caused the corners of Xiao Bai's mouth to curl into a faint smile. Feng Yu stayed in the mansion for 5 days. Initially, she was not used to it, but now, she was indifferent. It was as if it did not matter where she stayed. However, big sister Feng Yu, don't keep reading. Play with me. Yun Yun lay on the table and looked at Feng Yu, who was reading. Her face was filled with unhappiness. Feng Yu did not even raise her head as she said, Go play by yourself? Big sister Feng Yu. Yun Yun immediately felt even more conflicted. Feng Yu's face was filled with helplessness. For the past few days, her only worry was Yun Yun. All day long, she would drag Feng Yu to play this and that. In the first 2 days, Feng Yu would still accompany her. However, after a long time, she simply did not want to bother with her. Big sister Feng Yu, let's go make roasted mountain dumplings. Yun Yun seemed to have suddenly thought of something and said excitedly. Didn't you already know how to do it? When Feng Yu heard Yun Yun's words, the hand that was holding the book suddenly tightened a little. There was a faint calmness in her eyes, but the emotions hidden in her eyes were a little different. I didn't learn it. Big sister Feng Yu. Teach me how to do it. Yun Yun tugged at Feng Yu's hand and begged. Feng Yu helplessly put down the book in her hand. In the end, she couldn't refuse Yun Yun. The kitchen was emptied once again. The two women were busy in the kitchen. It was a different scene. What is she doing now? Xiao Bai, who was in the study, slowly put down the brush in his hand and asked habitually. Miss Feng Yu is teaching Miss Yun Yun how to make roasted mountain dumplings in the kitchen. Xing Shi was already used to his master's words. He answered calmly and accurately. His master asked this question no less than 5 times every day. Xing Shi really didn't understand. Since his master wanted to know so much, why didn't he go and take a look himself? She was clearly in his mansion. Xiao Bai was slightly stunned when he heard Xing Shi's answer. Then, the corners of his mouth curled up slightly as he said, "Let's go take a look." Chapter 2159. Yes, 11th interrogation officer hurriedly replied when he saw Xiao Bai stand up. When Xiao Bai arrived, he could already smell the fragrance wafting through the air. Feng Yu and Yun Yun were squatting beside the bonfire. From afar, Xiao Bai could see Feng Yu's serious expression. In his days, it made Xiao Bai recall the past. When they were young, Feng Yu had the same expression on her face in the wilderness. At that time, he wondered how someone could roast a pheasant with such seriousness and focus. Aya, brother Xiao Bai. Yun Yun was waiting in boredom. She turned her head and saw Xiao Bai standing under the tree. She immediately cried out in surprise. Feng Yu also turned her head and was a little surprised when she saw Xiao Bai. From Feng Yu's point of view, Xiao Bai didn't look like someone who would enter the kitchen. Him standing in the courtyard with 11th interrogation officer gave off a feeling of being out of place. Brother Xiao Bai, did you smell the aroma and follow it here? Yun Yun suddenly seemed to have thought of something. She stared at Xiao Bai vigilantly and said, Big sister Feng Yu made this for me to eat. You don't have a share. Feng Yu and Xiao Bai looked at Yun Yun's expression and twitched their mouths, their faces filled with helplessness. Yun Yun saw Xiao Bai's covetous look and hurriedly snatched the pheasant that was still roasting and ran away. Feng Yu looked at Yun Yun and hurriedly said, Be careful, it's still very hot. Got it? Yun Yun's reply was heard from afar and then disappeared. Feng Yu awkwardly looked at the dirt on her body. She said something to Xiao Bai and went to change her clothes. Only then did she return and sit with Xiao Bai in the pavilion, looking at the pond full of lotus flowers. Xiao Bai was dressed in black and stood with his hands behind his back. Feng Yu looked at Xiao Bai, who stood up and was silent for a while before asking, Xiao Bai, I haven't asked you why you're always dressed in black like the 9 emperors. Because when I first met my parents, they were dressed in black. When Xiao Bai heard Feng Yu's question, he raised his eyebrows slightly in surprise. There was a faint smile in his eyes as he said, Later, I got used to it. Feng Yu was speechless when she heard Xiao Bai's reply. Xiao Bai turned to Feng Yu and asked, Have you gotten used to living in the mansion? Yes, I want to send a message to Big Brother Ling. Can you help me? Feng Yu blinked slightly and asked Xiao Bai. All right. Xiao Bai nodded. Feng Yu probably didn't expect this, so Xiao Bai immediately called for a brush and ink. Inside the pavilion, Feng Yu lowered her head and carefully wrote a letter to her family. Xiao Bai's back was facing Feng Yu, and he stood to the side with his hands clasped behind his back. He was lost in thought as he stared at the lotus pond. A cool breeze blew past, and Feng Yu tilted her head slightly to look. She looked at Xiao Bai's fluttering skirt and his tall and slender figure. Feng Yu suddenly became a little absent-minded. Her dazed gaze was probably too passionate, causing Xiao Bai to suddenly turn his head. Feng Yu couldn't dodge in time and was caught. Her face instantly turned red. Heh. Xiao Bai looked at Feng Yu's rosy face, and a faint smile appeared in his eyes. Feng Yu. Xiao Bai approached Feng Yu and sat on the table. He casually swept away the brush and paper and raised Feng Yu's chin. His eyes were cold and moving. Chapter 2160. Feng Yu's heart was beating wildly at this moment. She was forced to raise her head, and her cheeks felt like they were on fire. Feng Yu was extremely embarrassed by Xiao Bai's stare. She tilted her head and wanted to avoid Xiao Bai's hand, but Xiao Bai forcefully grabbed her chin. He bent down and pressed his handsome face against Feng Yu's. His warm lips pressed against hers, and his gentle tongue slid across her lips and into her mouth, causing Feng Yu's mind to go blank. He was molesting her? After the extremely controlling kiss ended, Feng Yu's mind was still in a daze. Why did Xiaobai kiss her? Feng Yu, be this king's consort. Xiaobai's pitch-black eyes stared intently at Feng Yu as he spat out these words in an incomparably resolute manner. Feng Yu's brain once again crashed. Before she could recover from the kiss, she was shocked by Xiaobai's words. The surroundings fell into a long silence. I wanted to say this 8 years ago, but in the end, I was too cowardly to say it. Now that you have returned to my side. Xiaobai let go of Feng Yu and stared deeply at her. The seriousness in his words caused Feng Yu's mouth to drop slightly. Xiaobai, you misunderstood. When Feng Yu heard this, she suddenly said, I'm not returning to your side. I'm just passing by. Xiaobai clenched his fists slightly. Feng Yu was right. She didn't plan on staying. After a short moment of shock, she roughly understood what Xiaobai meant. Thinking that Xiaobai had misunderstood, she hurriedly stood up and said, I'm sorry to have made you misunderstand. I'm not, Feng Yu. Before Feng Yu finished speaking, she was interrupted by Xiaobai. Xiaobai stared at Feng Yu with a deep gaze. When Feng Yu saw Xiaobai like this, her heart also rose. Xiaobai was silent for a moment, then suddenly said, I'll deliver your letter. Thank you. Feng Yu bowed her head. After that, the two of them didn't say anything and left. However, after experiencing this incident, Feng Yu's heart inexplicably felt a very dangerous feeling. That's right, it was the feeling of being targeted. What is going on? Feng Yu was a bit anxious, but there was also a kind of uncontrollable joy. Feng Yu practiced the sword for a long time in this torturous state before slowly calming down. In the blink of an eye, 10 days had passed. Feng Yu originally thought that after the previous incident, the relationship between Feng Yu and Xiaobai would definitely be very awkward. Fortunately, in the following days, Xiaobai was no different from normal. Only then did Feng Yu let out a sigh of relief. Fortunately, she didn't have to think of a way to return to the general's residence. August arrived in the blink of an eye. Feng Yu was teaching Yun martial arts in the prince's mansion. Yun obviously had some foundation in martial arts, but she wasn't proficient in it. She didn't know where she heard it from, but she insisted that Feng Yu teach her sword dance. These days, she was very happy to learn it. Big sister Feng Yu, why do you know so many things? The afternoon sun was a bit poisonous. Feng Yu and Yun were hiding under the shade of a tree and talking. I don't know. Feng Yu replied with a faint smile as she wiped the sword in her hand. I also want to be as powerful as big sister Feng Yu. Yun looked at Feng Yu with a burning gaze and said, if that's the case, big brother Xiaobai will like me a little more. Chapter 2161. Feng Yu's originally smiling eyes froze when she heard Yun's last sentence. Her eyes widened slightly as she clenched her fists tightly. She looked at Yun and asked, You like Xiaobai a lot? Of course. I like brother Xiaobai the most. Yun said with a face full of surprise without thinking. Feng Yu smiled faintly and lowered her eyes to suppress the uncomfortable feeling in her heart. Yun was nagging about how good Xiaobai was, but Feng Yu didn't know why. But these words were so harsh in her ears, making Feng Yu feel uncomfortable all over. Feng Yu stood outside with a cloak draped over her shoulders. She looked at the distant horizon, the pitch-black night sky, and the Wang Fu in the dark night. What are you looking at? You're so lost in thought. Just as Feng Yu was in a daze, she suddenly heard a voice beside her. Feng Yu was so shocked that she trembled. She turned around and saw Xiaobai standing not far away with Interrogation 11, holding a lantern beside him. Why are you here? Feng Yu looked at Xiaobai in plain clothes and asked with a blink of her eyes. Just passing by, Xiaobai said without changing his expression. Of course, he wouldn't say that he was here to take a look. Oh. Feng Yu didn't believe that Xiaobai would come here for no reason. She suddenly remembered what Yun said during the day. She liked Xiaobai. Xiaobai was the prince of Qingping. He was so outstanding, so it was normal for him to like him. Most men would like a cute and obedient girl like Yun. Feng Yu thought like this, then slightly tilted her head to look at Xiaobai and said, Yun is already asleep. You can come find her tomorrow. When did this king say he was here to find her? Xiaobai frowned when he heard this and dissatisfaction flashed in his eyes. Oh, Feng Yu didn't say anything else. In Feng Yu's opinion, Xiaobai was too embarrassed to say it. But when she thought of the kiss from a few days ago, Feng Yu felt her chest tighten. Since he liked Yun, why did he say such things to her? The more Feng Yu thought about it, the more uncomfortable she felt. She said that she was tired and turned to leave. Xiaobai was left standing alone and silently clenched his fists. 11. What do you think this king should do to win back this woman's heart? Xiaobai felt a deep sense of powerlessness. He had already said it so clearly, but he was mercilessly rejected by Feng Yu. For such a long time, Xiaobai was getting closer and closer, but this damn woman completely ignored him. She even made Xiaobai feel that she was pushing him away. Xiaobai could plan meticulously in the court, and he could kill his enemies without hesitation. But now, in this situation, he had no clue at all. The feeling of helplessness made Xiaobai feel very vexed. He had a feeling that he couldn't control himself anymore. 8 years of waiting had worn out all of his patience. Your Highness, why don't you ask Master? Why don't we ask Madam? Interrogation Officer 11 was even more confused now. No, Xiaobai flatly refused without thinking. If his parents found out that he couldn't even win over a woman, they would definitely laugh at him. How could Xiaobai give Xiaochen this chance? He definitely wouldn't tell them. Xiaobai frowned deeply and watched the lights in the room go out. Only then did he slowly sigh and turn to leave. Chapter 2162. When Feng Yu woke up early in the morning, she heard that there was an important guest in the mansion today. I was wondering who it was. So it's you. Feng Yu looked at Xiao Yijuan, who was standing in front of her, and a faint smile appeared in her eyes. She looked at Xiao Yijuan and said, Why have you come to the mansion? I have some matters to discuss with Prince Qingping. I heard that you were staying here, so I came to take a look. Xiao Yijuan was still as calm and composed as ever. The way he spoke at a moderate pace made Feng Yu feel very comfortable listening to him. Oh, so it's like that. Feng Yu nodded silently with a faint smile in her eyes. Seeing that you look well in the mansion, I am relieved, Xiao Yijuan said with a smile. When Feng Yu heard Xiao Yijuan's words, she immediately smiled. In this corridor, the lady's smile was as beautiful as a flower, and it deeply hurt Xiaobai's eyes. When Feng Yu was facing him, she would never reveal such a smile. Xiaobai stood nearby and looked at Feng Yu, who was talking to Xiao Yijuan. That smile that came from the bottom of her heart made Xiaobai's face darken bit by bit. After standing there silently for a while, he turned and left. Master, Miss Feng Yu went out with Grand Tutor Xiao. Interrogation Officer 11 looked at Xiaobai, who had locked himself in the room and was silent for a while before he spoke. Xiaobai did not move and continued to read in silence. Interrogation Officer 11 stood at the side for a while before he left. Xiaobai sat there and did not move at all. He read that page of the book for an entire afternoon without flipping it. Only when the sky gradually darkened did Xiaobai stand up and arrive at the entrance of the residence with great precision. After bidding farewell to Xiao Yijuan, Feng Yu stepped into the mansion and saw Xiaobai standing nearby. She was instantly shocked and looked at Xiaobai in astonishment and asked, Why are you here? Are you going out of the mansion? Xiaobai only stared at Feng Yu and did not speak. Then, I'll go back first. Feng Yu was a little creeped out by Xiaobai's stare. She swallowed silently and turned to leave. Xiaobai, who had been standing still, suddenly walked towards Feng Yu with a cold face. Before Feng Yu could react, he picked her up and walked towards the courtyard. Everyone in the mansion watched this scene with wide eyes. When Yun, who was running over happily, saw this scene, her small mouth immediately opened wide. Xiaobai, are you crazy? Feng Yu was shocked. She quickly broke free and said, There are so many people watching. Put me down. I have already proposed marriage to your elder brother. Your Miaojiang will become a Tokyo, and you will be my wife. Xiaobai hugged Feng Yu tightly. He ignored Feng Yu's struggles and spoke with a cold expression. His words immediately caused Feng Yu's expression to change. What? What did you say? Feng Yu did not care whether Xiaobai was injured or not. She raised her leg and kicked towards Xiaobai's face. She pushed with her hand and landed on the ground. She glared at Xiaobai angrily and said, "What right do you have to make a decision without asking me first?" "I'll tell you." Xiaobai quickly dodged Feng Yu's leg. Seeing Feng Yu land safely on the ground, he silently let out a sigh of relief. "Tell me?" "Xiaobai, you are still so annoying." Chapter 2163. Feng Yu's eyes were filled with anger. She glared at Xiaobai and shouted angrily, causing Xiaobai's heart to tremble slightly. "Hate!" Feng Yu turned to leave after speaking. Xiaobai took a big step forward and grabbed Feng Yu's wrist. He stared deeply at Feng Yu and said, "Whether you hate or like it, it's a foregone conclusion that I want to marry you." "What do you mean?" Feng Yu's heart trembled when she heard this. She suddenly turned to look at Xiaobai and asked, "I have already asked the emperor to marry me. If you disobey the decree, as the head of Miaojiang, your Miaojiang will be affected." Xiaobai looked at Feng Yu quietly and said, "You." Feng Yu's eyes were filled with shock and anger. She never thought that Xiaobai would use the people of Miaojiang to threaten her and even mobilize the emperor. Feng Yu looked at Xiaobai's determined expression and clearly knew that if she didn't agree, Xiaobai would really dare to make a move on Miaojiang. "Let go." Feng Yu's heart was cold as she turned her head away and said. Xiaobai looked at Feng Yu's appearance. He didn't know why, but he suddenly felt that what he did was wrong. This was the fastest and most effective method Xiaobai could think of. Feng Yu would definitely agree to it, but now that he saw Feng Yu's eyes looking at him, Xiaobai suddenly felt panic. He didn't know why, but he felt like he had made a mistake. "What? You have the confidence to threaten me with Miaojiang, but you are still afraid that I will run away?" Feng Yu looked at Xiaobai with a sneer and said, "I guess, if I run away, you will tie up my brother and force me to show myself, right?" Feng Yu shook off Xiaobai's hand and turned to walk into her room. Xiaobai stood in place and looked at Feng Yu's figure. His eyes were filled with deep coldness. He just did what he wanted to do. As long as he could marry Feng Yu, he was willing to pay any price, as long as she was his princess. What was wrong with Miaojiang getting the best protection? He would treat Miaojiang well, so naturally, he would treat her well. As Xiaobai thought of this, he slowly suppressed the uneasiness in his heart and turned around to arrange many things. After Yun Yuan heard the news, she was shocked for a long time. Xiaobai really meant what he said. On the third day, the imperial edict was issued. The head of the Miaojiang tribe married Prince Qingping and became Princess Qingping. The wedding date was set to be after the crown prince's birthday, which meant that there were still 3 months left. This trip to the Miaojiang took a lot of time to prepare. When Fengling received the news, it had already been half a month. There was no time for Fengling to prepare. What followed was the emperor's imperial edict. The imperial edict had already been issued. There was no other way but to follow it. If they disobeyed the imperial edict, would they not care about the lives of so many people in Miaojiang? Big sister Feng Yu, just eat a little. It had already been half a month since this incident. At this moment, Feng Yu was wearing an inner garment and an outer robe as she sat in front of the window. Yun Yuan was holding a bowl of soup in her hand as she looked at Feng Yu with a distressed expression. "I'm not hungry." Feng Yu's expression was distant as she turned her head away indifferently. "But, big sister Feng Yu, you haven't eaten for 2 days. Just eat a little." Yun Yuan looked at Feng Yu with pleading eyes. Feng Yu slowly turned her head and looked at Yun Yuan. Seeing Yun Yuan's naive appearance, the corner of her mouth suddenly hooked up into a faint smile and asked, "I'm going to marry your brother Xiaobai. Aren't you angry?" Chapter 2164. Angry? Why should I be angry? Yun Yuan put down the bowl in her hand and stared at Feng Yu very seriously. "I'm very happy that big sister Feng Yu is going to marry big brother Xiaobai, but why are you unhappy? Don't you want to marry big brother Xiaobai?" Yun Yuan stared at Feng Yu silently and asked. Feng Yu's heart tightened when she heard that. A feeling of pain spread throughout her body. She didn't say a word and just sat there silently. Yun Yuan said a lot, but Feng Yu didn't say anything else. Yun Yuan looked at Feng Yu's appearance and silently lowered her head and left the room. When Yun left the room, she suddenly saw the person who appeared outside the room. It was a man in a dark purple robe. His expression was slightly cold as he walked over quickly. Yun was slightly stunned when she saw this person and then frowned. "You're that Grand Tutor, right? You're the younger brother of the 9th Emperors? Young Master Xiao Yijuan?" Yun had lived in the prince's residence for so long. How could she not know Xiao Yijuan? It was just that she hadn't seen him for a long time and was a little stunned when she suddenly saw him. "You are..." Xiao Yijuan stopped in his tracks and looked at Yun with some confusion. "My name is Yun. I'm Yun Tian's daughter. You know my father, right?" Yun arched her eyebrows and asked Xiao Yijuan. "So it's young lady Yun. Pardon my rudeness." Xiao Yijuan's eyes revealed a look of understanding. In Xiao Yijuan's blurry memory, there was indeed such a young lady. However, because it had been too long, Xiao Yijuan couldn't remember her. "Is young lady Fengyu inside?" Xiao Yijuan's purpose of coming this time was to see Fengyu. Xiao Yijuan naturally didn't forget. He frowned slightly and looked sideways at Yun. "Oh, big sister Fengyu is inside, but she hasn't eaten for 2 days. If you can help persuade big sister Fengyu, she's ignoring me," Yun said with an aggrieved expression. "She hasn't eaten for 2 days?" When Xiao Yijuan heard Yun's words, he immediately frowned. With a cold face, he bowed slightly to Yun before walking into the house. "Yun, I said that I'm not hungry," Fengyu slowly said when she heard the sound of the door opening. She appeared a little impatient. When she turned her head and saw Xiao Yijuan standing there, she immediately opened her mouth and lowered her eyes. "It's you." Yun turned her head away. "You're not eating or drinking. Are you making life difficult for yourself, or are you angry with someone?" Xiao Yijuan looked at Yun's abnormally pale face, and his eyes were filled with heartache. "I didn't." Fengyu leaned back slightly, looked up at Xiao Yijuan and asked, "You're also a lobbyist he hired?" Xiao Yijuan could clearly see the cold disdain in Fengyu's eyes when she said this. "You don't want to marry Xiao Bai." Xiao Yijuan stared intently at Fengyu and said. The determination in his words made Fengyu suddenly smile and say, "In your eyes, what's there to not want? Isn't it always up to you to say what you want? What right do I have to say to someone who can do whatever he wants?" Fengyu's words were filled with indifference. "I can help you." Xiao Yijuan stared deeply at Fengyu and said, "Fengyu, I sent you off when you left. Now that you're back, I don't want to see you so unhappy." Chapter 2165. When Fengyu heard Xiao Yijuan's words, she was stunned. She raised her eyes and looked at the man standing in front of her. The serious expression on his face instantly made Fengyu's heart ache. "Thank you." Fengyu slowly lowered her head. There were thousands of words in her heart that she couldn't express. She could only give Xiao Yijuan these 2 words. "Fengyu." Xiao Yijuan looked at Fengyu with a complicated gaze. His lips moved slightly. The words that were on the verge of coming out of his heart were slowly swallowed when he saw Fengyu's tired eyes. "If there's anything, you can come find me. You are a friend of the 9th Imperial Concubine. I will protect you," Xiao Yijuan said as he placed the jade pendant on his waist into Fengyu's hand. "Okay." Fengyu was silent for a moment before she agreed. Xiao Yijuan didn't stay for long before leaving. Fengyu placed the jade pendant on the table and stared at it in a daze. Finally, she carefully placed it into her dressing box. Her body sitting in front of the window added a sense of sadness. When Xiao Bai found out that Xiao Yijuan had arrived, it was already nighttime. When he returned to the residence, he heard the news and hurriedly rushed to Fengyu's room. Fengyu put on her outer clothes in a panic and turned her head to look outside the door. Xiao Bai probably didn't think that Fengyu was changing her clothes. He hurriedly turned around and a faint blush crept onto his handsome face. He quietly said, "I didn't know. You were changing your clothes?" Fengyu looked at Xiao Bai's back and hurriedly put on her clothes. She also took a cloak from the side and wrapped it around her body. Only then did she say with a red face, "I'm done." Her voice was as soft as a mosquito's foot. She was so shy that she wanted to hide her head. Xiao Bai originally felt a little embarrassed, but when he turned his head and saw Fengyu nervously sitting on the bed and not daring to move, He immediately found it funny. There was a faint smile in his voice as he said, "It's not like we haven't seen each other when we were young. Xiaobai, you're asking for a beating." When Fengyu heard Xiaobai's words, her face turned black. She glared at Xiaobai and shouted angrily, "Ahem." Xiaobai's lips curled into a faint smile. He looked at Fengyu, who had been angered by him. He suddenly felt that Fengyu was very intelligent, just like the Fengyu in his memories. They hadn't talked like this for a long time. Xiaobai looked at Fengyu with a burning gaze. Fengyu became even more shy under Xiaobai's gaze. She turned her head to avoid Xiaobai's gaze and said in a muffled voice, "What are you doing in my room so late at night? I heard that Xiao Yijuan is here today. What is he here for?" Xiaobai finally remembered the purpose of his visit and asked with a slight frown, "Nothing much. I just said a few words and left." There was no abnormality on her face. When Xiaobai heard Fengyu's words, he frowned slightly and said, "I'm going on a long trip." Fengyu originally didn't look at Xiaobai, but after hearing Xiaobai's words, she raised her head and looked at him. "There is a group of bandits in the West Mountain that are very rampant. I'm following orders to suppress them." Xiaobai saw the questioning look in Fengyu's eyes and slightly pursed his lips. When Fengyu heard Xiaobai's words, she was stunned. What kind of bandits actually wanted Xiaobai to personally suppress them? It seemed that they weren't simple. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.